So I'm going to start by talking about early U.S. colonies and the beginnings of the United States pre-formation as a country. The first people to the United States, the indigenous native population, first came to this country through a land bridge that used to connect Siberia to Alaska and Canada. These people walked across this land bridge around 10,000 BCE, or during the last Great Ice Age, and since populated the American continents. Until then, they went more or less undisturbed by the European populations until about the late 15th century, when Christopher Columbus came by in his controversial expedition to the New World. It's very interesting to discuss whether or not it's a new world when it's been around for a very long time, but regardless of that, I mean, his expedition to what he thought was India, hence why the natives were called Indians, was not really, it really generated interest in colonizing the Americas and other parts of the world. Prior to Columbus, there was only one notable colonization attempt in the Americas, which was in Newfoundland. There, in the 13th century, there were Scandinavian peoples led by the famous lead Ericsson. Not the first attempt at colonization of the Americas, but certainly the most interesting, was the Roanoke colony in North Carolina. In 1584, Sir Walter Raleigh got a charter from Queen Elizabeth I to form a colony there for entrepreneurial purposes. The early colonies, as I should really point out, were not so much attempts for people to escape religious persecution as about trying to get a fast buck. That's what the early colonies were established for. Columbus, in fact, went to India to get spices and jewels. This was with the appeal of the New World, this new place with these new treasures that no one had ever seen before. So that was the appeal in 1584 of establishing colony there. This all happened during the Anglo-Spanish War, during which the English and Spanish, as you'd assume, had some tensions over religion for part of it. On August 18, 1590, John White, who helped establish settlement at Roanoke, returned from England after 3 years with a new shipment of supplies to the colony, found the colony strangely deserted. There were no clues as to why all the people had gone. The settlement had deserted for some time, clearly. The only hint that was there was the word Croatoan carved into something or other. Which assumed at the time meant Croatoan Island, meaning people had maybe fled there, but it was never really determined where the entire population of this colony went to. Some speculate that the Native American populations maybe had killed the people, or maybe disease had wiped them all out within the 3 years that he had gone back. I mean, there's really no idea where these people went. So it's one of the more fascinating tales of colonization of the United States. Jamestown in the Chesapeake Bay area of Virginia was the second colony of interest in the U.S. It was established May 14, 1607, when it was chartered by Queen Elizabeth I, and it lasted until 1699, when it was incorporated to what would become the colony of Virginia. The Virginia Company established it as sort of an entrepreneurial expedition. Again, it was about making money, like I mentioned before with the Roanoke colony. It was named for Elizabeth, who was known as the Virgin Queen because she never married. Interesting how you equate virginity with marriage in that time. The area was chosen because there weren't a lot of threats from outside natives. But on the other hand, the reason there weren't any natives there is because the natives near the land was essentially a swamp, and you couldn't really grow anything on it. A lot of mosquitoes there. So I mean, that's why there weren't a lot of natives around who were living in the area. So it seemed kind of safe-ish, but, you know, really gross. Initially, it was rough getting a settlement off the ground, especially during the year, the Starving Year, which was from 1609 to 1610, in which 80% of the people starved. So 60 of the 214 colonists survived that year from starvation. And the reason they didn't do so well, part was because the winter that year was particularly rough, but also because people weren't really working the land and trying to... It wasn't so much about the survival of the colony at that point. It wasn't about establishing a settlement. It was about getting money out of it as quickly as possible. And because the people were trying to make money, their motivations were different. So they were trying to, plant or do other things. They weren't trying to survive, and that was the initial problem with Jamestown. It wasn't until John Smith got in there and led the colony, he said something along the lines of, if you're not going to work, then you're going to starve. And that was what sort of got people into trying to establish a settlement and realize we're going to be here for a while, we might as well make the best of it and try to, live long enough to see our profits. Another problem facing the colony was Powhatan and his tribe of people who they didn't live on Jamestown per se because again it was swampy, but they lived nearby. This tribe of Indians who were known as the Paspahe, I don't know how to pronounce that, I'll try to spell it out for you in annotation. So Powhatan's tribe was giving the colonists a hard time, but of course this tribe was completely annihilated within 3 years of warfare by the Jamestown colonists. So we have some rough native-settler relations going on, which would later stain a lot of other parts of the United States history. But moving on. John Rolfe, who would later marry the Chief Powhatan's daughter Pocahontas, in 1614 began harvesting tobacco, which is how the Virginia Company got its money back from this colony. So at this point, their settlement was not returning its investment until tobacco was harvested there. Tobacco is a crop which really ruins the land. You plant it once and the soil dries up. And you have to keep planting it in different areas every year because it will completely destroy the soil. So it's not a particularly environmentally friendly crop, but it was a very profitable one. People in Europe like to smoke. The natives probably like to smoke too once they got their hand on it. I don't know, but people in Europe like to smoke. So this was a very good thing. It's a very good cash crop. It's a cash crop for this colony. In 1619, because of all this tobacco, there were slaves brought in from Africa to help harvest it, which would establish a tradition of slavery in the United States prior to the official slave trade, which began in the 1660s. Jamestown would be the first successful English colonization of the United States. The second, which we're going to talk about next, is Plymouth Colony in Massachusetts. Now to my favorite colony, because I'm biased, Plymouth Colony in what would become Massachusetts. It was established in 1620 by a group of Anglican separatists who were escaping religious persecution in England because of Oliver Cromwell and the situation going on there. There was a crackdown on people who were seen as Puritans or really sanctimonious. So these settlers decided to go to the Americas and try to worship however they liked. They were set on, there's a spot in Virginia where they were supposed to go, but because of navigational errors and the seas, they ended up in Massachusetts instead. The Anglican separatists, known as Pilgrims, traveled to the New World on the Mayflower ship, which used to be a cargo ship, which would that transported a lot of wine. That was the ship and how they got there. A lot of people, as my professor in my genes class said, I don't know how many students I've had over the years who have claimed to have come from the Mayflower. The first settlers were allegedly landed at Plymouth Rock, which today you can still find preserved today and marked as such as the first landing of the settlers. There's Plymouth Plantation, Massachusetts, where there's reenactments of this life. These settlers wore very simple clothing. They had very sort of strict religious beliefs. So they were free to practice those at that time. Plymouth plays an important part in U.S. folklore, especially as relates to the first Thanksgiving. In 1621, the Pilgrims, populations who lived, the Anglican separatists, were known as Pilgrims. The Pilgrims, with the help of Squanto and the Patuxet tribe in the area, had a big meal together to sort of thank the Squanto and the Patuxet for helping them survive their first year in this new colony. Especially for those of you who live in New England, winters here can be very rough, which was what the Pilgrims found when they came here in that first winter. So the fact that those that survived thanked them. I mean, Squanto and his tribe, they knew how to grow corn and other important crops in the area. They knew the land, so the Pilgrims initially were quite friendly with them, which was a difference from Jamestown colony, which their attitude was, oh my god, let's kill these guys. Eventually, of course, things turned sour. I mean, King Philip's War would certainly taint relations in the area, and especially how the Puritans of Massachusetts Bay Colony treated their native population that lived near them. Things would get ugly quickly, but at this point they were still very happy to, they were just thankful to have survived, regardless of how they had done so. So that was early U.S. settlements, both successful and unsuccessful. Some themes that I talked about a little bit today that are going to show up later in U.S. history. Very important, the relationship between indigenous people of the United States and later settlers there, going from some relations, as we see in Plymouth, being amicable initially, and as we see in Jamestown, overwhelmingly hostile. Overall, I can see these relations they get more hostile as time goes on. You have things that come up like the Indian Removal Act later on. There's a lot of tension. There's a lot of tension that arises from the Native American populations, and rightly so. You have a group of settlers who come in from foreign countries, who look different, who speak different languages, who do have different clothing, all this different culture, and they essentially create a government around the native populations, which of course would be very insulting. These relationships very much sour over time. Another theme that we're going to see crop up again is the capitalist nature of the United States, as seen first in the entrepreneurial nature of the Jamestown colony, where as Alexis de Tocqueville would later say in his essay Democracy in America, I do not mean that there is a deficiency of wealthy individuals in the United States. I know of no country, indeed, where the love of money has taken stronger hold on the affections of men. That I find one of the most accurate things you could say about the United States. Religious freedom is definitely a big theme in U.S. history. Later on, it'll take form in separation of church and state, which would be ironic because the early Puritans and Pilgrim settlers in Massachusetts Bay and Plymouth were not so much wouldn't be a fan of separation of church and state. Very much, especially the Puritan society, Massachusetts Bay, church and state were very much interlocked, very much part of each other. Again, partially ironic is that these were the first settlers of Massachusetts Bay, but when it became a state, and nowadays the state of Massachusetts is seen as one of the most liberal states and very much not religious at all. There are, of course, large Catholic populations, but again, we'll get to that later on. One thing you don't see in very early settlements in the United States is colonial identity. Not until these people have lived together for very long periods of time do you see any sort of Virginian identity, Massachusetts identity, Georgia identity, etc. Because these were at very first just loose collections of the people forced together for a common reason. They weren't, yes, it was a common reason, not strong enough to unite them at first, but later on when you get to the American Revolution, and in the years after that, you find a U.S. identity coming about, and separate colonial identities out of that, and vice versa. But next time, that's what we're going to talk about next time, the American Revolution. So I hope you guys learned something. If I made a mistake, let me know in comments or message me on Tumblr or whatever. If you have any questions, let me know. I can answer them best that I can. Thank you for watching. I appreciate it a lot. Thank you. Bye. Look, it's Yoshi. I have a Yoshi hat. Cool. This isn't a hat. This is, in fact, it's a cardboard sort of. It's a package, but my mom cut it just so wear it on my head, and I'm calling it a hat. So don't judge me. So that's what the first Thanksgiving is. Just sort of thanking them for helping them live and stuff, and just thanking each other. It was a lovely love fest up in there. Hinga dinga durgan.